starting to come out of the paralysis. I'm still weak. I can move my arms. I just can't lift them. I can move them. And I can move my head. I can't lift it. And I can move maybe a little bit. You move my leg. I just can't lift them. And that's it, I guess.
Roll back to the left to 2, 3, roll back to 4. We're gonna try to, if he's listening, like he is out here, we're gonna go for that tighter turn. Outside line, 5, 6. And again, if he's listening, I'm gonna do that tighter turn. We're gonna go to 7 in the center. Tighter turn to 8 if he's listening. Come off 8, go to 9 if he's listening, tight turn. 10, I'm gonna back him off a little bit so he doesn't take down a rail on my last fence.
I can have what looks like a seizure, which my whole body will contract. My muscles will contract so much that it will distort my wrists, my arms.
Will the dog stay on the ground at the rescue? If
47.
Yeah, we can do
All right. Have 3 foot buddy.
I don't know how much of my life will allow me to ride and compete. So I'm gonna do it for as long as I can. My name is Monica, and I am clinically diagnosed with hypokalemic periodic paralysis. My story begins before I was even born. My father was born in Barranquilla, Colombia in 1939, and he moved to the United States in 1961 with his whole family. And my mom was born in Herkimer, New York in 1945, and they met and they got married in 1963. And soon after they got married, over the next 11 years, they had 5 kids. I'm the youngest out of the 5. One of the biggest challenges that I've ever faced in my life was racism. Extreme racism is how I would say, because it went beyond name calling. It actually went so far as assault on some of my family members, them setting a large bush in front of our house on fire. They also poured acid on our driveway to burn it into the cement. So my dad literally had to break up the cement and re-pour it to get rid of it. And they did that in the attempt of spelling the N-word on our driveway. And they misspelled it, which isn't surprising, but they misspelled it and it read Niger. And then just the day-to-day going to school, they used to throw oranges at us. Fighting was just a normal thing. I mean, being in a fist fight was your average day. But we, as a family, we were raised to believe that this hatred is directed towards us for nothing that belongs to us. You know, it's just a hatred. I look back at that part of my childhood with some understanding that helped me become the person I am today. It helped me understand that the world is not always nice. Things aren't always going to be easy or pleasant. And also that there are going to be people who judge you that don't know you. In my journey for my diagnosis, I have been judged and I have been accused of faking it. And I can understand why someone might think I'm faking it, because if I do truly have a form of periodic paralysis, it's a condition of where I can be fully functioning 1 minute and totally paralyzed the next. And I understand how that can be hard for people to comprehend or to believe. So it is very challenging. I wasn't clinically diagnosed until I was in my late 30s, but I had symptoms my entire life. And as a child, I had symptoms of weakness, pain. Doctors would say, well, it's growing pains. And you know, the reason why she doesn't want to really walk is because she has pain. And I couldn't really walk at one point without either holding on to something or with crutches. And we just accepted that it was these growing pains. It started to get worse. And the episodes became more debilitating, but they didn't happen all the time. So I always assumed, and my family always assumed, that it was just the flu. You know, you feel weak or run down because you've been doing too much. And you know, if you just rest and take it easy for a couple of days, yeah, I would start to feel better. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s when it started to become very debilitating, to the point where I was having problems lifting a drink up to my mouth, you know, a cup up to my mouth. Until it got to a point in my early 30s where it was happening a lot more often, and I was having so much difficulty on a regular basis that we started to look a little bit more into it. And then after we started looking into it, it was as if the rug just got pulled out one day and I went fully paralyzed and I could not move at all. And I ended up going to the ER, and by the time I got to the ER, I could move, but it was not coordinated. I couldn't stand on my own still. They ended up doing a spinal tap. I was in the hospital for 9 days, and they couldn't figure it out. Then they thought, because I started getting facial palsy, they thought, okay, she's had a stroke. And so they did all of that, and it ended up not being that. And so they discharged me and said, okay, we want you to go to Mayo Clinic. And so I went to Mayo Clinic. They had no idea, and that went on for about a year. I was in a wheelchair most of the time, and I was having a great deal of difficulty even doing like personal hygiene stuff, like brushing my hair, brushing my teeth. And I ended up somehow, something in my blood work, which now we know had nothing to do with my periodic paralysis, but had me end up at an immunologist's office. And he took a look at my stuff, and he thought maybe it was MS. And so he sent me to the MS specialist in our area. He looked at everything and said, I don't think it's MS, but I want to send you to a movement specialist. So I went to the movement specialist at Shands, and that's when I was first clinically diagnosed. They didn't know for sure. They thought it was either hypokalemic periodic paralysis, because my blood test did show a consistent low potassium, or stiff person syndrome, because I would have these full body contractions. So my body was doing weird things. I would go from complete paralysis sometimes to full body contractions sometimes. So nothing was really making a lot of sense. And after that diagnosis, I kind of stopped looking for answers, and I started the treatment for hypokalemic periodic paralysis, and my symptoms kept progressing. And they got to the point where I started looking like I was having these seizures, where my body would have these convulsions, muscles would be contracting, and it was very scary. And that is when doctors started to think that it was psychogenic. sometimes when I would go to the ER and I would be still paralyzed, I was accused of faking it, attention-seeking behavior, and it's very difficult to be at such a vulnerable state where you can't even take care of yourself. You can't get yourself to the bathroom. You can't get hair out of your face even. You are completely dependent on the people that are around you. And for them to not believe you and to basically abandon you because they think that you're faking it, and maybe if they help you that you're going to get some kind of reward out of that. It's a terrifying place to be, and not really understanding what exactly is happening to your body. And it wasn't just the medical doctors or nurses that thought I was faking it. It was also some people in my personal life that also thought I was faking it as well. The challenging part was finding a doctor that had even heard of periodic paralysis so that they knew how to treat me. Well, I was fortunate enough that my neurologist that had sent me to Shands, he was familiar with periodic paralysis because he actually had another patient who had hypokalemic periodic paralysis. So he had asked the other patient, is it okay if he connected the two of us? And she agreed, and she was on the board of the Periodic Paralysis Association, and she introduced me to that organization. And I went to my first conference within that first year. Before I had gone to the conference, she had told me about a video that was on YouTube of one of the patients that has hypokalemic periodic paralysis having an episode. And she said, you might want to check it out. And I went online and I looked at it, and it was very emotional for me because that was definitely my paralysis episodes. And so I went to the conference, and at that first conference about 10 years ago is when they drew my blood and said, whoever is interested in participating in this genetic testing, we're still exploring this. Give us time. It could be a decade or more before we have any answers. The other amazing thing about that first conference was meeting other people and hearing their stories and hearing that their stories were very similar to mine. It helped me realize that I wasn't alone.
I've been diagnosed for about 5-6 years now, and I was diagnosed when I was about 20 years old. I was shopping for a birthday present for a friend's kid. All of a sudden, just like half my body's like just lagging. It's real bad. I'm telling my mom, like, I don't feel so great. And then she's like, you need to sit down? I'm like, yeah, I do. And so she starts helping me to a chair, and before I could even get there, like my whole side goes. I'm just on the floor. She's trying to drag me to the chair. She thinks I'm having a stroke, so she's calling 911. She's trying to get the store employees to help me. They're trying to figure out if they should get us a shopping cart, like some sort of loader, to just run me to the exit, because we're about one stop from the hospital. And so they run me there. They run a bunch of tests, and they just misdiagnosed me with the wrong thing, even though it's just low potassium probably at this point. Workforce has always seemed like it's gonna be a challenge. Like I've had problems getting through school years most times because some health problem always crops up. So it's like how I'm gonna get through a job is always gonna seem dodgy. Yeah. I don't know how that's gonna go, but I still want to give it a go. I mean, that's the goal in the end. Haven't given up on that, and not going to yet.
I'm I'm 27 and I have periodic paralysis. I was diagnosed with periodic paralysis probably about 3 or 4 years ago. I've had muscle weakness like since I was a kid. I remember the first time I was playing soccer. I loved playing soccer when I was a kid, and it was like a cold Michigan morning having to play soccer outside, and my legs would get heavy and I'd have to go sit on the sideline, and I was like, it was normal, you know. I was like, every kid has to go sit down. This is why kids go sit on the sideline. It's because their legs get heavy, like, you know. No, that's not why kids go sit on the sideline. It's just kind of been with me my whole life. Next steps for me, keep advocating on a bigger stage for periodic paralysis and my different conditions. Keep letting people know that my happiness isn't dependent on my health. Keep sharing my story to help elevate other people's stories and the patient perspective.
The one thing that should have been obvious in the beginning, but didn't become obvious until much, much later, was I wasn't the only person in my family experiencing these symptoms. My oldest sister, Christine, she was having these episodes where she was very fatigued, very weak, and, you know, we all thought the same thing that they thought with me. You know, she overdid it. She's working too many hours at work. She was a young mom with a full career, 2 kids. You know, not unbelievable to think that, you know, her body's just having these moments where it's needing a break. When she was in her 30s, she went out for a walk, and she ended up not being able to finish the walk and having to sit on a lawn in her neighborhood because her legs weren't working. But now we look back and we're like, obviously that was her having an episode. And then over time, our children grew, and it started to look as if our kids were starting to have some of the same symptoms that we did as children. My son, Connor, he is my oldest, started to have some symptoms that were very similar to mine in childhood. My daughter, Maya, and then Christine's daughter, Tori, also started to show some symptoms. Tori, though, seems to have more issues than any of us have had. She's been in the hospital a lot more frequently than any of us, and at a much younger age. To have our family's genetic variances looked at could be possibly life-changing, because it is the difference between a clinical diagnosis and a genetic diagnosis. And a clinical diagnosis doesn't carry as much weight as a genetic diagnosis. I mean, I still come across many doctors that don't give it any weight. You know, they still consider it, you know, psychogenic. So the possibility of having proof I'm hoping will be life-changing. It had been 7 years since they took the blood at the conference, my first conference, and it was the Saturday before Easter. I opened up my emails, and there was an email from Dr. Tarleton, who was the doctor who drew my blood at the conference, because he had read a paper of a gentleman in Asia who was having symptoms very similar to mine and had this SCN4A variant, but he also had a CLCN1 mutation. So Dr. Tarleton wanted permission to check our DNA. So from there, he started collecting DNA from my immediate family. And then once he collected that information, he approached Dr. Cannon with all of the information and said, Dr. Cannon, hey, I think you might want to look into this. And now our family's DNA is with Dr. Cannon. The idea that we might finally have answers and confirmation of a real diagnosis, or not a real diagnosis, but the correct diagnosis, is exciting and scary at the same time.
Periodic paralysis is an inherited condition of muscle in which individuals have repetitive episodes of severe weakness. The name, it's kind of a bad choice of words because there's actually nothing periodic about the attacks. They can last for several minutes to hours or even a day or longer. A characteristic feature is many individuals have trigger events or things they know they need to avoid, or it might bring on an episode. And the frequency is highly variable. So some individuals may have only a few episodes in their entire life, whereas others might have them as often as weekly and really interferes with jobs, going to school, or things like that. Now, the episodes of weakness, it's not as though I just don't feel like getting up off the couch. These are severe episodes that are often described as my legs feel heavy, I can't walk by myself, or I need to use my arms to help get out of a chair. I can't walk up the stairs, it's tough to get up off the toilet. Sometimes even being able to raise a limb up against gravity. Oftentimes these episodes happen the first thing in the morning upon awakening, and some people even have trouble rolling over in bed. So they can be very severe. The really unusual feature of these episodes is that individuals get better. They recover. It's a very characteristic feature of this condition. And normally you wouldn't expect that, especially to get better in 30 minutes or a couple of hours. And so it can be very confusing not only to the affected individuals, but also the healthcare professionals. Go to the emergency room, perhaps having had a severe episode, your family takes you there. By the time you check in and they take all your information, it's been a couple of hours, you start to get better, and nobody believes you. You tell them just an hour ago, I couldn't stand up, I couldn't even raise my arm, and they'll say, do you have a lot of stress in your life? Things like that, because it's a rare condition. A lot of people haven't seen it, and they're not accustomed to something that can fluctuate so rapidly and yet have such pronounced features and syndromes. So that's periodic paralysis. So interestingly, there's more than one type of periodic paralysis. And so if you look at the cluster of symptoms that one family has, it may be different from another. And so physicians have separated this into groups, and one of the big clues is the type of trigger factors that people have. When some individuals, for example, eating a lot of sweets or carbohydrate-rich meal might trigger an attack. And it turns out what's going on is in all of us. When you eat sweets, part of your body's response in taking up the sugar into the body tissues causes potassium to go inside the muscle in the liver. And your potassium goes low, in that case, in all of us. But in individuals with this form of periodic paralysis, that puts them at risk of having weakness. So their type is called hypokalemic periodic paralysis. When they have low potassium, they get paralysis. It's not that their body has a problem maintaining potassium levels. They go through the normal swings like all of us do. But when their potassium goes low, their muscles don't operate properly, and they'll have an attack of weakness. There's another set where individuals are more likely to have an attack of weakness if they skip a meal, if they're fasting. And in all of us in that condition, your potassium can tend to be a little bit higher or after exercise. This happens in all of us. But for individuals at risk for this type of periodic paralysis, they'll have an attack of weakness when the potassium is high. So this is called hyperkalemic periodic paralysis. So physicians recognized these patterns almost 100 years ago and correlated these trigger factors with the level of potassium in the blood. And that's been one of the main methods by which we can distinguish different forms of periodic paralysis and thereby make different recommendations about how lifestyle changes can help reduce the risk of having an attack or what to do if you should have an episode. Another thing to recognize is that these are incredibly rare conditions. So in the entire United States, there may be 3,000 or 4,000 individuals with periodic paralysis. That means something like 1 in 100,000 individuals has periodic paralysis. This is part of the challenge for awareness and recognition by the medical team that even raises as a diagnostic possibility this person may have periodic paralysis. And mentioning how rare these are, there's even another variant of periodic paralysis that's 10 times less frequent. It's called the Anderson-Tawil syndrome, named after the physicians who first described it. And what's unusual about this form of periodic paralysis is that it's the only one where other organ systems in the body are affected besides muscle. So these individuals with Anderson-Tawil syndrome may have the episodes of weakness, but also an irregularity of the heartbeat that puts them at risk of having fainting spells. Also, the development of their bones is different, so they tend to be shorter or have a small neck, characteristic shape of the face, or curved fingers. Not every case of periodic paralysis is the same. That's one of the challenges at arriving at a correct diagnosis and why we have to be open-minded when we learn about the symptoms a patient has. Monica's case is really interesting because here it's these severe attacks of weakness that finally leads her to say, we need to get to the bottom of this and get medical attention. So, episodes of weakness from which you recover, having multiple ones, sometimes activity related, you might begin to think about some type of periodic paralysis. But on the other hand, she has these attacks of incredible stiffness, severe, painful stiffness, which is unusual. When she first approached the health professionals, they thought, this might be hypokalemic periodic paralysis. If you think of periodic paralysis in general, that's one of the most common forms. You might consider taking potassium supplements. It could help reduce the frequency or the severity of an attack. But this just didn't really ring true because usually an individual with hypokalemic periodic paralysis, while they would have recurrent episodes of weakness that can be very severe, the muscle stiffness piece shouldn't be there. Muscle stiffness is often because the excitability of the muscle is abnormally enhanced. It's something neurologists call myotonia, where individuals, again, another inherited muscle disease, after a voluntary contraction, they can't let go, they can't relax. So the question was, is that what's going on with Monica? Does she actually have myotonia and periodic paralysis? What are these unusual episodes of stiffness? Not only that, but she's not the only one in her family who has these symptoms. So when you have a cluster of symptoms that, although unusual and atypical, are happening in multiple individuals, and then there was a genetic hint as well. Jack Tarleton called me up and said, we've found variations in Monica's family, in their DNA, in two hotspots where parts of the DNA code for what are called ion channels that regulate the excitability of muscle. So these are areas and genes that were known to be involved in periodic paralysis, but the ones that were found in Monica's family had not been reported before, the one in the sodium channel. So the question is, does this mean anything? Because it turns out all of us have a lot of random variability in our DNA. In the parts of the DNA that are important, that are coding for proteins, on average, you have 20,000 variations. So what do these mean that we've found in Monica's family? Is this the reason for the episodes of weakness, or is it just a red herring? So this is where our lab comes in. So for about the past 30 years, we've been fascinated about the biological basis of periodic paralysis, and I've been working on trying to understand why some variations in DNA put people at risk of having recurrent attacks of weakness, why the muscles temporarily misbehave, the excitability is disrupted, and then it spontaneously recovers. So once we found that a few variations were found in Monica's family, the next question was, well, how do we figure this out? And so what our lab did was take this information and recreate DNA with those mutations in our laboratory, have cells take up this DNA and make the ion channels so that we could perform very sensitive recordings and ask the question, do these channels misbehave in Monica's muscle because of this variation in the DNA?
So what we need to do is make the mutant DNA, put it inside a cell. It will make the ion channel, and then we record the behavior of the channel. When we want to make copies of DNA and amplify a piece of it, that's in this machine. It's a thermal cycler that does the PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. And all we're doing is taking our tubes. In the very bottom of this tube would be a little tiny chemical reaction that's making copies of DNA. And then when it's done copying a piece, we heat it up so that everything melts apart, comes apart. And then the pieces can reassemble and make another copy. And it goes over and over, so you get 2 copies, 4 copies, 8 copies, 16 copies, 32 copies. And so you can very quickly, hugely amplify a little segment of DNA. This is Marbella Quinones, who has been working in our lab for many years. And she's at a station where we manipulate DNA. One of the things about working with DNA is a lot of times you need to separate the pieces and then put them together sort of like Tinker Toys. And we separate the pieces on the basis of the size. And the DNA is in that little tiny tube she has between her thumb and index finger, the colored dye. And so what she's going to do is load the DNA into a translucent slab of agarose. It's literally like Jell-O. And once all the DNA is loaded into those little wells, just a little droplet, and all lined up, then we apply a voltage across, and the DNA will start to move through the Jell-O. Manipulating DNA, the steps are to first amplify it, is the PCR machine, then separate the pieces on the basis of the size. That's called gel electrophoresis in that slab of Jell-O. And the DNA is stained with a dye that shows up under an ultraviolet light, and then we use a camera to take a picture. And so these horizontal lines is the dye that's staining a fragment of DNA.
So even being motivated to investigate the consequences of these gene mutations, because we have several affected individuals with consistent clinical features, and the gene defects are found in all the affected members of the family, it's a big commitment. One person has to work on this for a couple of months to get an answer as to what's the consequence of these gene mutations. How could they affect the function of muscle to be responsible for the symptoms in Monica's family?
The tricky part, and I think this is where people have a hard time believing and accusing you of faking your symptoms, is because it's not always there. It can come and go. You know, it does. It comes and goes. Over the years, I've learned that there's certain triggers that can bring out an episode. But even if I do everything right, I could still have an episode. So it's very unpredictable, which kind of makes life really difficult, because at any moment it can just explode, and now your day is not the way your day was going to be. And what if that day you have a presentation at work, or what if that day you have to get on a plane to fly somewhere? It makes your life really hard. And, finding someone who's willing to join you on that unpredictable ride, can be challenging. But it's also, I think dating in general is challenging, right? Even for people who are healthy. People never really want to show you who they are right out of the gate. So you're kind of always you're kind of learning who they are as you go along. And with this condition, I think that it just makes it a lot harder, because, I'm this one day and I'm that the next day. What I decided to do, because I found myself dating again at the age of 40, and I thought, first of all, who's going to sign up for this? Like, who's going to go sign me up? So I was like, I'll just start dating and just see even what's out there. And then the big question was, when do I tell them? Do you tell them on the first date, by the way, hi, I'm Monica, and I have some rare condition that makes me go paralyzed or makes my body contract sometimes, but I had a really good time. I hope you call me. When do you tell them? And so what I decided was, it's a first date or a second date or a third date. You have no idea where the relationship is going. I thought, when I started to get this sense of maybe this might be going somewhere, now I need to tell them. And I will have to say, I was pleasantly surprised. no one ever said, oh my gosh, okay, cool, and then never called me again. The two guys that I did tell while I was dating they were like, okay, and once they seemed to be okay with it, just so that they could understand exactly what it was like, I showed them that video that I watched years ago of that person going through an episode to really give them a good idea. I wanted them to be fully aware of what this could be. That didn't even slow them down. They were like, no, okay. But just like dating, can be, those relationships didn't last. And I found myself dating someone who, in the beginning, I considered a friend. I was going through a divorce. He was going through a breakup. We were friends. And then as things progressed over a year, we ended up dating. And of course, he knew that I had this condition, but he didn't see an episode for about 9 months. And when he did finally witness an episode, he said he felt prepared. He's like, the video helped. The fact that we talked about it, I answered any questions that he had. We were realists about it, right? We realized this is part of my life. And if you're going to be in my life, it's going to be something that you're going to experience eventually. We got married about 6 years later, and my condition, no matter what it ends up being, is in my life. And we both recognized that so much that it actually was in our vows. And he even made a comment about how he watched the video and he knew what he was getting himself into.
As your husband, I vow to cherish you and love you in good days and bad, to protect you and comfort you in sickness and in health. And yes, in front of everyone, I will acknowledge that I have seen the video and I know what I'm getting into.
Your kind patience and loving heart has brought me peace, comfort, and happiness. Yes, our story is about a chance meeting on a rainy night. It is a story of how I thought you were on a date with Mark. It is a story of how you accepted me, my children, my disability, and even stinky little Winston.
This condition just comes in and blows your life up. So my husband and I, we wanted to have, even though we were in our 40s, we wanted to have an amazing wedding. And so we invested a lot of time and money into our wedding. And I know a lot of people, when they're planning the wedding, think about, oh, what is the weather going to be? Or is my uncle going to get too drunk and make a scene? Where my biggest fear was, am I going to be able to walk down the aisle? And am I going to be able to have my first dance? And 2 weeks before my wedding, I was in the hospital. And I was in a wheelchair. So when we did the walkthrough at the venue for the wedding, I was in a wheelchair. And all I wanted was to be able to walk down the aisle and have my first dance. Other than that, I was fine if I was going to have to be in a wheelchair for the rest of it. Fortunately, I was doing much better. I couldn't dance as much as I wanted to at the after party, but I was able to have a great time at my wedding. One of the things that I also think is a big part of it not becoming an issue in my relationship is I do what I can to prevent episodes from happening. And diet is a big part of controlling episodes. And, some people are like, oh, I'm just going to cheat. I'm going to have this. Well, if I cheat and have that, I could end up having an episode. And now my family is having to pay for it, not just myself, but they're having to pay for it. So I try to be very considerate of the decisions I make and how it affects the people in my life. But the one thing that I've had to learn very early on was this condition, again, no matter what it ends up being, doesn't define me. It's not who I am. I'm Monica, and I happen to have a debilitating condition that comes in and out of my life. And I think that he also sees me that way, because that's how I live my life, and that's how he sees me as a person. I am not the only fortunate person in my family to have been able to find someone who is able to accept us for who we are with all of our flaws. But my son is very fortunate to have found his husband. My sister found herself single in her 40s and found a wonderful man, and they're happily married. My niece, Tori, also just recently got married. My daughter has no interest right now of dating or getting married, so we've all been very fortunate to find people who accept us as we are.
So after a couple of months of work, we have some answers for Monica and her family. Half of our job was already done for us because one of the gene variations has already been investigated, the one in a chloride channel. And we looked at the consequence of having this second mutation, this unusual one that's never been reported. And I have to say that if you look at the map of where this gene defect occurs in the channel, you wouldn't expect it to cause a problem. And so, we wouldn't have had the initiative to do all this work except for the fact that in Monica's family, there were multiple affected individuals. They all had consistent symptoms. The gene defect was found with them and not the unaffected members. So there was a big motivation to go the extra mile. And we were delighted that after all this work, we found the mutant channels don't behave normally. It's subtle, so it's not, screaming, oh, here's another classic periodic paralysis mutation, but it was definitely abnormal. And the other interesting thing is the way in which the channel was misbehaving puts them at risk for hyperkalemic periodic paralysis. Paralysis that's made worse in situations of elevated potassium. And of course, they were told they probably have a variation of hypokalemic periodic paralysis. So the recommendations for management and how to avoid episodes and attacks were just the opposite. They would be taking potassium supplements and trying to keep the potassium high. But based on the way this channel is misbehaving and the type of defect we saw in the lab, I'm going to tell them that's exactly the wrong thing to do because they probably have a variation of hyperkalemic periodic paralysis.
I do not think what you have is an atypical form of hypokalemic periodic paralysis, low potassium. I don't think that's what you have. I'm very interested to hear your experiences and continue to look at this, but I'll share why I think it's more in the hyper-PPPMC. If you were to look at this and say, hey, they have a variation in their sodium channel, could this be a hypo-PP mutation? Not likely, not at all. Doesn't follow the pattern at all. So the fact that you have myotonia and the fact that you don't have one of these typical locations where the hypo-PP mutations occur, not going to be hypo-PP. This defect has been found in these diseases, never in hypo-PP. In fact, when this kind of change is found in hypo-PP, the change is in the other direction. So again, nothing is consistent with hypo-PP in your family, nothing.
So another fascinating aspect of the results we found in Monica's family is not only was this variation in the sodium channel gene not expected to cause a problem, it looked like it was going to be innocuous, but it occurs in 1 in 1,000 people in the general population. So there are two reasons why you would think this isn't the answer. It's not in a hot spot, and it occurs in the random population. But what we showed in the lab is it does change the way the channel behaves. It subtly influences channel behavior that would put you at risk for episodes of stiffness and maybe weakness. And so the big aha moment here is putting together that they have a double hit, this very subtle problem with the sodium channel that's out there in the general population, combined with the other defect in the chloride channel. So in Monica's case, her mom had one defect, her dad had the other. Neither one had a muscle problem, but by chance, they each passed on this trait. She got them both. That's what causes a problem. It happened several times to other members in the family that they just had the unlucky chance of having lightning strike twice and getting both copies of two abnormal genes that came together by chance.
I felt like I wanted to write all of these letters to all of these doctors saying, here, see, it is periodic paralysis, and you know, let me educate you on something. Yes. You know, and I'm sure the whole let me educate you something would not have gone over well. But and I wanted to run around and tell everybody, you know, it wasn't in my head. See, I wasn't faking it. It was very liberating to be set free of these allegations of attention-seeking behavior and all of that other stuff that came along with, you know, the way that I and we were treated. But when we had the Zoom and Dr. Cannon told us that it was a form of periodic paralysis, we were glad to have confirmation that it was a form of periodic paralysis. But then when he told us that it was actually hyper and not hypo, I think a lot of things started to make sense because we never really benefited from the treatment for hypos. You know, I was still in the hospital once a month. My niece was always in the hospital, and the episodes were pretty frequent. I didn't hesitate. I was like, okay, I'm changing everything. I'm gonna live my life as a hyper now. I was like, okay, this is what you recommend. We're gonna give it a try. Before the conference, before Dr. Cannon presents our family's findings, they gave us an opportunity to meet with him in person, and of course we jumped at it.
Nothing is typical, and that's the lesson here. You know, well-intended doctors, they study, you read the textbook, you read the medical papers. You're dealing with the challenge. I'm not trying to make excuses for physicians, but you're dealing with the challenge of a rare disorder. You know, is it going to come to my level of consciousness? Am I going to think that this is a possible diagnosis?
Right.
But not only that, in your family, it's atypical. So you take something rare with an unusual presentation. So it's not too surprising that it was a long journey.
And they're trying to help.
It can be a long journey to getting a correct diagnosis in periodic paralysis. But it's not easy because not only is this a very rare condition, but remember the symptoms are transient, they're temporary. So somebody may have a severe attack of weakness at home, unable to get up off the couch. Family members have to carry the person to the car. But by the time you get to the emergency room, get checked in, half hour later the doctor comes to see you, you've already gotten significantly better. And so the fact that strength has returned creates a great deal of skepticism on the fact of the medical team when you tell them, oh, an hour ago I couldn't move at all. So it's the symptoms coming and going that's a problem. Another challenge is even if the medical team is clued into the fact that, oh, severe weakness that spontaneously resolves and has occurred more than once, maybe this is periodic paralysis. Oh, the blood potassium is supposed to be abnormal in periodic paralysis. Let's check the potassium level. Comes back, more often than not, it's going to be in the normal range. It could be normal for many reasons, probably because the individual has already recovered from this attack and everything has reversed. So that can happen a lot. The other is that the changes in potassium are risk factors. It's not black and white, all or none. And for a medical team that's inexperienced, these are very rare conditions. If the potassium comes back in a normal level, then that gets excluded as a possible diagnosis. And that causes a big delay and is a huge problem in this disorder. And we have to make patients and medical teams aware that even though these rare diseases of muscle are famous for the fact that potassium levels are abnormal, they're not going to be abnormal with every single episode. And because of the time delay between when the weakness occurred and when you measure the blood level, it might be normal.
One thing that I would look back on is, again, Monica was clinically diagnosed once upon a time with hypo. And when she would go to the hospital, having an episode, they would treat her with potassium. They would hang a bag of potassium, sometimes piggyback it with magnesium. It would take days, but seemingly she would get better. But then, to come to find out that's really the exact opposite. Diagnosis, right?
But it eventually corrects itself anyway, right? So it just looked like it was the potassium help.
That's right. That's right. It can be very difficult to tease it apart.
A characteristic feature of periodic paralysis is spontaneous recovery. That's one of the defining features of the disease. But that raises some really interesting challenges. So first of all, by the time you get seen in the emergency room, you might be considerably better, and it makes it difficult to make a diagnosis. And also, intervention. Did I get better because of what I did or in spite of what I did? So you could actually even do something that might be ill-advised and still end up getting better because the body does an amazing job of shifting these electrolytes back in the balance between what's in the muscle and what's outside the muscle, which enables recovery to occur in periodic paralysis and someone to regain their strength.
Now, as this story has unfolded for both of you and your family, is it any better if you have to go to the emergency room? Do they understand now?
So to answer your question very specifically, the early days when I knew Monica 7-8 years ago, we would go to the hospital in an episode, and you most likely got a doctor that wasn't aware, didn't know, and one story, the doctor was actually Googling on his phone, reading on his phone, says here that you shouldn't be doing this, and I guess in some regards that's better than someone that's thinking you're either it's psychogenic or it's all in your head or otherwise. Right. So maybe that's one step better, but that's a really mild step.
Yeah, and the other thing for me is they look at my blood work and that is what they're going off of, and my blood work doesn't show them anything, and that is and now even like you were saying, once the paper is out, I can take the paper and be like, this is me, please believe me.
That information, the reason why it was so life-changing was because for almost 12 years, we were doing the wrong thing. We were actually doing the opposite of what we should be doing. We were taking potassium instead of trying to avoid it. We were eating the wrong diet. And then when we were in episodes, doctors were treating us as hypos and actually giving us potassium in hopes that it would help reverse the episode. So it has been life-changing on so many levels. I went from being in the hospital once a month to being in the hospital like once a year. So far, because it's only been a year, but I've only been in the hospital for my periodic paralysis one time. So that's huge.
Although the episodes of weakness and periodic paralysis may be quite severe, unable to stand up or walk independently, fortunately, the muscles of breathing are usually not affected. At times, people can feel as though their breathing isn't as strong as it had been. Their voice might be getting softer, difficulty swallowing. Those are the times when you need to go to the emergency room. If you have an attack that's out of the ordinary for you, prolonged, or you're having feel as though your deep breathing is becoming difficult, that's when you'd want to go to the emergency room.
What is the next step? Is there going to be a new form of periodic paralysis?
I think what this has taught us is that everybody needs to be more open-minded. Healthcare professionals, families, about what it means to have a genetic variant. I mean, that's kind of the Achilles heel of all this wonderful technology and information that we get. So it's figuring this out, and what your family has taught us is that even if something isn't absolutely perfect match for our current level of knowledge, we've got to adapt. We need to understand and push the boundaries forward. And you've taught us what it means to have a double hit. I mean, you guys have lightning striking twice with two different genetic variants that when they occur together, as it has in all the affected individuals, that's what it takes for this to happen.
One of the things that we are very grateful for, besides Dr. Cannon and him doing this research, was the opportunity to thank him in person for what he was able to do for our family.
For me, I don't know if you understand the gift that you've given our family. And I'm trying to say this without breaking down. And I want to make sure that you understand that that this was not a small gift. This was, and now I am getting emotional. This was our lives, right? It was everything. And I need you to understand the importance of it, but I don't know how to do that without making it weird. and it is so important that what you do as not only as a scientist or a researcher, but you as a person, because there's a lot of personal investment that you put into these names, right?
Sure.
And I wish, and we need to figure out how we can do this for so many others.
Well, thank you for that. And again, we couldn't do any of this without the enthusiastic participation of the families. And it takes a lot of resources to pull this together from all areas, people coming forward, the university, financial support, and I just wish we had more hands on deck and people to help, because there's a lot of need out there, and we're excited about continuing to work in this area.
The situation in Monica's family is somewhat unique in that 2 gene defects need to occur in the same individual in order for someone to have symptoms and clinical expression. And this raises a whole new way of thinking about variations in genes and how we interpret the results that come back from gene testing. Because remember, the sodium channel change in Monica's family happens in 1 in 1,000 individuals. Those people don't have periodic paralysis, but they sort of carry a modifier, a really subtle risk. And we need to get this in the gene databases, in the reports that these testing companies provide, that while this isn't a pathogenic mutation, it's, if you will, a modifier or a risk factor that, when combined with something else, may cause someone to have periodic paralysis.
Watching Dr. Cannon walk towards the stage to present our family's research findings was surreal. It was surreal because I had been to many conferences, and when I went there to find information, to get answers, and now not only do I have answers, but he is about to prove to the world that I wasn't faking it.
I'd just like to thank Monica and her entire family for sharing their story with us, for getting us engaged in this Odyssey, and then for being willing to share it so you all can see what is possible. So let me walk over here for a moment. I don't know how many of you have seen these pedigrees. These are families. So this is Monica and her husband and her 2 children. So all the circles are women, the squares are men. Those are Monica's parents. So the color code is the red part is this new variant of unknown significance in the sodium channel, and the blue one is the established recessive mutation in the color channel.
So Monica's story emphasizes the value of getting gene testing. So an astute clinician who might have seen periodic paralysis before might feel confident in assigning the particular type of periodic paralysis someone has, but gene testing can now add another layer of confidence in the diagnosis. And it's really from understanding which genes were affected and what those changes were that led to me recognizing hypokalemic periodic paralysis couldn't be the correct diagnosis for Monica and her family. So I would encourage individuals, even if you think you're confident with a clinical diagnosis, and that's an important first step, follow it up with a gene testing because it can be confirmatory or informative that you need to think more broadly.
You put them both in there and stuff begins to happen. The two of them together enhance the excitability so that all this electrical activity that comes after the simulated contraction is going on that shouldn't be happening.
With all the successes we've had with Monica's family, there's still questions. That's the way medicine works. So it was very surprising. She had a subtle sodium channel defect that needed to be combined with a chloride channel mutation in order for them to be symptomatic. And that explained the stiffness, but we're still scratching our heads about why she's at risk for the recurrent episodes of weakness, which are very real. I've seen videos. And so we have more to do. And we can use the information from Monica's family and her particular mutation and what we've seen in the laboratory to better understand how your muscles can intermittently have failure of contraction and lead to episodes of weakness. So for me personally, attending the Periodic Paralysis Association meetings is a wonderful learning experience. I mean, no neurologist has an opportunity to see 20, 30 individuals with periodic paralysis all in one setting. You know, we all read the medical journals, we look at the textbooks, we've written some of the chapters in the textbooks, and I learn more from talking to these individuals and finding out how this disease affects them, what works, what doesn't work. And I would encourage any physician who has patients with periodic paralysis or wants to learn more about this disease to come to the PPA. Come talk to these individuals, learn how it affects their lives, and you'll become better at recognizing periodic paralysis and making the diagnosis and possibly also helping your patients that are in your practice with this rare disorder.
My name is Dr. Connor Nichols, and I'm an emergency medicine physician. I've been practicing for almost 20 years, predominantly in the level and trauma center academic field. I have actually heard of periodic paralysis, mainly for board purposes. It's mainly buzzwords that we remember, like hypokalemic periodic paralysis, young Asian males, possibly thyroid issues. I feel like I learned a lot when I came to the conference because I learned that it was a lot more complex than I knew initially. Not only is there hypokalemic periodic paralysis, there's hyperkalemic periodic paralysis. Your patient may present and have a normal potassium. So it can be very challenging to diagnose. And I think the most touching thing was when the panel of patients were up there and the questioner was asking them, you know, what are your experiences that you've had in the emergency department, things like that. And it was just very eye-opening to hear some of the answers and how the patients had been treated. And it seems kind of dehumanizing and made me put myself in the place of the patient. And it just was horrible the way some of them had been treated and just how long it takes for them to come to the diagnosis. And, you know, most of the time it's probably not going to be made in the emergency department, but still all those years of having to go through, you know, all those things, and it just seems dehumanizing.
Our lab has focused on periodic paralysis for 30 years now. There's still a lot to do. Not only do we study ion channels in isolation, we've made many mouse models, and we're right at the point now where we have terrific ideas for new therapeutic interventions. We're testing them in our animal models, and they're almost ready for clinical trials. And I want to stick with this for another decade and bring all this knowledge to these patients and really improve the opportunities for disease modification and maybe even a cure for periodic paralysis.
When it was decided that the documentary would be based on my journey of clinical diagnosis through research to the end result, which in the beginning of all of this, we didn't know what the end result was going to be. We didn't know if the research was going to confirm that it was a type of periodic paralysis or that it was anything that would explain the symptoms. So that was very, scary. I like to live my life as a normal person. I hide this part of my life from people who do not need to know what I experience and what I live with. To document it, to take videos of it, it was very scary and put me in a very vulnerable place. And my biggest fear was that's not how I want people to know me or to talk about me. I'm so much more than this condition and these symptoms. So I didn't want to be known as, oh, that's that lady who, goes paralyzed sometimes or has these weird things that look like a seizure. I didn't want to be known for that. I did it. I'm doing it because I'm hoping that this will change what it means to have periodic paralysis, so that it will be something that people are like, oh, I remember I saw a documentary on that. And so that people who come after me, especially my children, are not going to have the same struggles that I had with this whole journey. I don't know how much of my life will allow me to ride and compete. I'm going to do it for as long as I can. And I know that a lot of people think that I'm stupid or crazy for putting myself at a risk of riding this large animal over these jumps. But it's my passion. It's what I love to do. And I do take precautions. My horse is a good boy, and if I decide that I can't finish the course, he actually feels it. He starts to react because he feels the weakness sometimes before I want to accept it. And he starts to let me know, hey, listen, I'm not going as forward because you don't have as much leg. Or, are you sure you want to go over this fence? You seem a little wobbly. And if I need to, I pull him out, middle of a course. And he is okay. He totally understands. And he also understands that he's going to still get his treats. He's still going to be told he's a good boy. They're a lot smarter than we like to give them credit for. And I'm going to continue to ride for as long as I can.